Namaste dear learners, and a very warm welcome back to this course, Introduction to Indian Psychology. In our previous lectures, we looked at the etymology of the term psychology, and we realized that the understanding of psychology itself has not been constant across time, and therefore it became valuable to actually look at how the concept of psyche evolved over time and what was the understanding of logia. How do you study the different attributions to the word psyche? We then looked at how the discipline itself evolved as the understanding of psychology was changing. And today we are going to be looking at certain definitions. All of these are complementary, so there would be overlaps in terms of how we are understanding the development of the word, how the definitions are forming up, and how that is influencing the growth of the subject as such. So today's lecture is going to be on psychology, its definitions. I will be taking you through the rationale for studying the definitions. From there, we'll move on to certain significant definitions, starting from the basics that we're already very familiar with, and moving on to more contemporary ones, which are more inclusive in the subjects that they are covering. And then we'll look at the definitions of psychology and their implications. So the question, why do definitions matter? The first and foremost thing is that in order to understand anything, we have to be able to first define it. So therefore, the definition of any subject or any topic helps us to get an understanding of the scope that it covers. Secondly, every definition corresponds to a certain worldview. Therefore, understanding the definition also helps us understand the worldview on which it is based. And this therefore entails some very important questions of philosophy that we must adhere to, or we must take into consideration when we go into the study of the particular subject. So the first one here is ontology. Ontology deals with the nature of reality. What exists, what is real, what is unreal, and on that basis, how do we go about conducting the various experiments we need to do. Epistemology itself comes from the word to know, the methods of knowing. So in epistemology, we look at the different ways of knowing something. How do we know what is true, what is untrue, etc.? How do we prove that what we know is true? We then move on to praxis. Praxis is related to the application of that knowledge. How do we apply this knowledge in different contexts? And finally, we look at axiology. Axiology is the study of ethics. What are the values that guide this knowledge? And very fascinatingly, we will see that as the definitions of psychology changed, the way in which we define and we understand each of these starts varying significantly. So we look at certain important definitions of psychology first. The basic one that we've already looked at earlier is that psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior. In its broader contemporary definition, it has come to mean that psychology is a science that studies mental processes, a little more precise than mind, experiences and behavior in different contexts by using methods of biological and social sciences to obtain data systematically. Okay, so we see that the definition has also included the methodologies that we would adopt in order to arrive at the understanding of human nature. We'll do a quick recap of what we have looked at in the previous classes in order to understand the etymology and evolution of the definition itself. So when we go to the etymology of the term psychology, we see that it consists of two words, psyche, which means soul originally, can also be pronounced as psyche, and then we have the term logos, which means the word or the study, etc. So if we are faithful to the original intent of the words that are making up the term psychology, we see that psychology can be defined as a study of the soul. And this meaning was there from ancient Greece to the classical period, and also we find references to this kind of an understanding of psychology in the medieval times when psychology was still within the domain of philosophy. When we come into the early modern definitions, the focus becomes on consciousness because of the experiments that Wundt was conducting and on subjective experience. This then changed in the behaviorist era where it got narrowed down to observable behavior only. With the advent of cognitive revolution, it reintroduced mind and mental processes were brought to the core. And in more contemporary times, we see that there is a attempt to integrate these definitions, and we see that it is a study of mind, behavior, biology, culture, context, etc. The Indian parallel for psychology that we normally use is Manovidya, Manovijnana, Manashastram. These are certain terms that are quite commonly used. But then Mana here implies the knowledge of the mind. Okay, Mana is the mind, and Vidya would mean the knowledge of. So it is the knowledge of the mind. And what we discover here is that possibly we are making the error of trying to translate the term in its most contemporary meaning, where it has come to refer to mind, and therefore we are trying to do a direct translation in order to understand it as Manovidya. But in the Indian context, first of all, this term in itself did not exist as such from ancient times. There was no specific reference to the discipline of mind sciences, although there was a lot of documentation around the explorations of mind and human nature. But a specific term was not coined as such. But the focus of Indian psychology has always been not just limited to mind, but something beyond or the soul. And therefore, would it be right to equate psychology not just to Manovidya, but also to Atmavidya, or the knowledge of the self? So as we delve into the domain of Indian psychology in a few classes, we will see how or what is the understanding of human nature, and what are the essential relationship of the mind, of consciousness, of the deeper self, etc. Moving on to the definitions that we find in structuralism and functionalism. So in structuralism, Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener in the late 19th century, they were looking at consciousness because they were talking of structuralism and trying to understand the study of consciousness itself using experimental methods. So they talked of psychology being the science of conscious experience. And this was undertaken by analyzing consciousness into its basic elements via introspection. The next psychologist, William James, who was also a student of Wundt, he talked about psychology in terms of functionalism. This is also in the late 19th century, and he talks about how mind serves adaptive purposes. It's not enough to understand how we are conscious of the world around us, but for him, what was critical was to see how do we use psychology to adapt to the environment in which we are existing. In the study of psychology entailed the understanding of the consciousness as a stream. It focused on function and application, and we see its implications also in learning, etc. And here we see that there was a shift from analyzing the elements of consciousness to understanding its adaptive value and practical applications. We then move on to behaviorism and psychoanalysis. They are very different approaches to psychology. So in behaviorism, the different scholars, as you can see, scientists were Ivan Pavlov, John Watson, F.P. Skinner. This was in the early 1900s. So there they say that psychology was the science of observable behavior and responses, because they wanted to have more tangible ways of measurement in order to understand what are the features of human nature and activity. So their focus was on objective measurement, stimulus-response mechanism. Moving on, Sigmund Freud actually predated the behaviorist school, which rejected psychoanalytic approaches to psychology. But then Sigmund Freud himself added a different dimension to the study of psychology. He observed that whatever happens is not just based on the superficial or the active mind of the individual. There are many subconscious motives that drive an individual's actions. So he defines psychology as the science of unconscious motivations and conflicts. And in this case, what they were studying were the unconscious drives that shape behavior and consciousness. So we see the contrast here between objectivity versus subjective depth, observable versus hidden motivations. And these definitions therefore help us appreciate the manner in which those particular schools of psychology developed in their respective ways. So moving on to the next set of definitions, we see that they emerge from the Gestalt psychology, humanistic, as well as the cognitive psychologies. In Gestalt psychology, which was founded by Max Wertheimer, Kurt Koffka, and Wolfgang Köhler in the early 20th century, psychology was defined as the study of organized wholes. because Gestalt was about looking at problems in a holistic manner rather than looking at them in the parts. And then their focus was on how mind organizes sensory information in order to make a sense of the complete picture. In the humanistic psychology that followed with Carl Rogers, Abraham Maslow in the 1950s and in the 1960s, we see that psychology was not just about under the mental faculties, but it was also about understanding human growth. So therefore, it got defined as the study of human growth, meaning and self-actualization. The focus of humanistic psychology was on trying to understand what are those factors that push an individual to excel in whatever they're doing, and what are those needs that need to be fulfilled in order for that individual to experience self-actualization. We then move on to cognitive psychology, the founders being Ulrich Neisser, Jean Piaget, and this was in the mid-1950s and the 1970s. So their psychology is defined as the study of mental processes. We see that parallelly the whole world of the computers was evolving, and so they were interested in equating how mind also processes different activities like attention, memory, thinking, language, and its direct application was especially in the context of development of children in their learning abilities. Here we see that each of the different schools of psychology have different patterns, and they emphasize on different aspects of the scope of what psychology can study. So we see that there is a study of wholes versus parts, growth versus processes, etc. Moving on now, we see the definitions of psychology in biological, evolutionary, cultural, and social psychologies. We see here that in biological psychology, they define it as the study of behavior through brain, neurotransmitters, and genetics. And this is because they recognize that the human body is responding to the environment, and these can be traced through the ways in which the neurons are firing in the brain and the genetics is responding. The next definition is from evolutionary psychology, and this defines it as the study of psychological mechanisms evolved for adaptive advantage. This is also something that we notice in the animal kingdom, where there are a lot of behavioral patterns that have occurred because of the evolutionary nature of that particular species. So similarly, there are certain behaviors that we have acquired and that we are honing in order to not only survive but also to thrive. So the next context for the definition is for cultural and cross-cultural psychologies. In this, we see that the psychology is defined as the study of how culture shapes psychological processes and behavior. And this is where Indian psychology can really step onto the stage along with many other psychologies. But that is because of the recognition that theories are universal, but in their responses, there is a cultural component that shapes the individual's response to different scenarios. And therefore, that becomes an area, or that's a fascinating area of study. We then have social psychology, and this is talking about psychology as a study of individual behavior in social context. We are all social animals, they say, and therefore, what is it that we are getting shaped as, or how is society shaping us, and how are we shaping society? So how are we being influenced, and how are we influencing the society around us? This becomes the domain of study for social psychology. And therefore, we see that there is no single definition that encompasses all of psychology. The field itself is a very pluralistic field. Moving on to a quick summary of the key definitions of psychology and some of the gains and losses. I will start from the more contemporary times, where we see that structuralism defines psychology as a science of conscious elements. There were some gains in the process because it considered consciousness to be valid. Before Wundt, psychology was not there as a field as such. It was more in the domains of philosophy, as we've seen. But here suddenly we were going to perform experimental methods to study consciousness. And the losses was that it was unreliable because of the dependence on introspection as a tool to understand the reactions or understand the sensations of consciousness that the individual is experiencing. And it ignored the unconscious. In functionalism, the definition is that it is the study of how mind serves adaptive purposes. And here, it looks into the functional dimensions is in focus, We talk of the experimental method in order and the observational method, and the losses are that introspection is excluded. In behaviorism, the definition is of science as observable behavior. So objective measurement was the gain, and animal research became very important ways in which we arrived at different theories. The losses were that consciousness was completely excluded, and therefore it became reductionist in its scope. Moving on to psychoanalysis, just the other end of the spectrum, it talked about the study of the unconscious drives. So the gains were suddenly there was depth, meaning, development, clinical insight that emerged. But the losses were that there was a problem of unfalsifiability. You could not disprove what somebody was saying, and therefore it was not desirable in the scientific context. There was also some sexism because it talks a lot about the drives of reproductory drives of the forces of nature as being important for whatever activities that one is undertaking. And determinism, because if you've been conditioned in the past, that is what is going to determine your future behavior. Humanism talks about the definition of psychology as a study of human growth, meaning, self-actualization. The gains were the growth and the meaning, the development, the experimental, subjective nature of this particular approach. And the losses were that it was not always measurable and not sufficiently objective. We talk of cognitivism next. In this, psychology is defined as the science of mental processes. And in this context, we see that consciousness was restored and mechanism was understood in a slightly different context. The losses were that computational metaphors were limiting because the computer is after all just a machine, and to think that the human being is just a machine is again reducing the scope of human potential, and culture was ignored. In biologism, we see the definition as being a study via the brain and genetics. The gains were that suddenly we were able to study neural mechanisms, there was precision in the correlation that we were able to establish, and pharmacology also underwent a substantial development in this case. The losses were that there was a reductionism because we are not merely biological creatures, and it had a certain deterministic nature which was also counterproductive to the scope that human nature offers. In culturalism, we talked of psychology being culturally contingent discipline. The gains were that there was a diversity that was recognized, power was acknowledged, power as in the different dynamics of power within a society. All of this was taken into consideration. And the losses were that there was a risk of relativism and it was harder to generalize because now suddenly you see that there were, beyond universalisms, there were certain specific cultural traits that defined an individual. And then in socialism, we have the study of behavior in the social context. So this was contextually rooted, a very, very important phenomenon. And then it was observable and yet subjective in nature. The challenge with that was the risk of multi-factor variability. So if you want to do explorations and research in social sciences, we are not so sure often that it is only because of our particular intervention that we are getting a certain result. Because the individual has got so many dimensions of their being and are engaging with so many other factors in between the two encounters that we might have experimentally, that there are many confounding variables that might actually impact the nature of the results. So for these words, we move on and we see that Indian psychology, the definition and framework by Cornelissen, Mishra and Verma, it talks about an approach based on the ideas and practices in the Indian subcontinent, focusing on consciousness as fundamental, ethics central to well-being, and self-realization as continuous process. So the core of this is that it is Chaitanya, there is consciousness as the primary reality. The goal is Atmajnana or self-knowledge for self-realization. The method that was proposed was yoga, meditation, direct inquiry into consciousness. So what is the scope of psychology? The breadth and domains. Psychology encompasses normal and abnormal behavior. It looks into mental health and disorder. In terms of cognition, it is occupied with perception, attention, memory, learning, thinking, and language. When it comes to emotion, it studies what motivates an individual, what are the personality traits, and what is responsible for individual differences. In social processes, it talks about relationships, groups, culture, aggression, cooperation. In short, the dynamics of human interpersonal relationships. And then in lifespan development, we look at childhood and what are the factors that allow a child to develop in the way they do into adolescence, adulthood, aging. What are the different features of each of these age groups as well? And then in the applied context, we see that psychology is applied extensively in education, in work, health, law, sports, clinical settings. In fact, there is no domain of human existence that can be free of psychological investigations, because we are a human being. As long as we are there, every field becomes a relevant case for psychological studies. And finally, we see that the spectrum of psychology expands from the molecular neuroscience all the way up to cultural studies, and from the laboratory to real-world applications. What is the scope? At multiple levels of analysis, we see that there is a need to understand the biological dimension, where the brain, nervous system, neurotransmitters, genetics are having an impact. We need to look at it as an individual, in the individual context, with the cognition, emotion, personality and consciousness. We need to also understand the interpersonal relationships with families and group dynamics. We need to look at it from a societal context of culture, institutions, social movements and history. And then we also need to look at it from a transcendent perspective, like we do in Indian psychology and other mystic traditions as well. Here we look at consciousness beyond the mind, spiritual dimensions, etc. So when we are looking at psychology, we would need to understand the human being in all these holistic dimensions. And then what do we need to do, and what we are discovering more and more, that there is an integration that is taking place between modern psychology and which is recognizing that there is a need for this multi-level understanding of human experience. And some food for thought for you. So this is by the mother who writes this in the book on education. She says, "An aimless life is always a miserable life. Every one of you should have an aim, but do not forget that on the quality of your aim will depend the quality of your life. Your aim should be high and wide, generous and disinterested. This will make your life precious to yourself and to others." List of references. Thank you and many happy discoveries.